The Americans had just broken through the lethal defenses of Omaha Beach, but immediately faced a trap neither tanks nor air support could solve. They had a massive army stranded on a French shoreline without a functioning deep-water port. To survive, they executed an impossible solution, dragging a colossal artificial harbor across the English Channel. But just days after this miracle structure began operating, it was violently smashed to pieces in the surf, severing the American lifeline. With their only port in ruins, why didn't the Allied invasion instantly collapse right there on the sand? To understand how catastrophic that loss was, you have to look at the terrifying math of the Normandy invasion. By the end of the second day alone, the United States had poured roughly 130,000 troops and 17,000 vehicles onto the French coast. This was not just a static infantry force holding a line. It was an insatiable mechanical beast. Every single tank, half-track, and infantry battalion demanded a continuous, uninterrupted river of gasoline, rations, and high-explosive shells just to survive the next hour. But physics was actively working against the Americans. The Normandy coastline is defined by shallow, open tidal flats. The massive, deep-draft cargo ships carrying the heavy bulk of the Allied arsenal could not get anywhere near the sand. They were forced to drop anchor miles offshore in deep water. Relying strictly on a scattered fleet of small, flat-bottomed landing craft to ferry cargo through the surf was a losing game. It was too slow, deeply vulnerable to the violent tides, and mathematically inadequate for the sheer volume required. If that supply chain broke, American heavy armor would simply stall out in the hedgerows, and the artillery would run completely dry in the face of German counterattacks. The pressure was only accelerating. The daily supply target was designed to surge exponentially, from 6,000 tons required on D-Day plus 4, jumping to 9,000, and then hitting a staggering 12,000 tons every 24 hours by D plus 16. The logic was absolute. You cannot feed an invasion of that magnitude across an open, unprotected beach. So, how do you keep a mechanized army alive and advancing when the nearest viable heavy port cannot possibly be captured in time? The obvious answer, the one dictated by centuries of conventional military doctrine, was simply to capture a major French port immediately upon landing. An army of that size needed deep-water berths, heavy lifting cranes, and miles of paved quays to offload its mechanized power. But history had already proven, in blood, that attempting to seize a heavily fortified European harbor straight from the sea was a guaranteed catastrophe. To understand why the Allies refused to assault a port directly on D-Day, you have to look back to the morning of August 19, 1942. Nearly 2 years before Normandy, the Allies launched a massive raid on the French coastal town of Dieppe. It was designed as a critical test, a violent probe to see if a mechanized force could cross the English Channel, seize a working harbor, hold it, and withdraw. The result was a tactical slaughter. A force of over 6,000 predominantly Canadian troops hit the beaches beneath the town. The German defenders did not even need to maneuver their reserves to meet the threat. They simply locked themselves inside their elevated concrete bunkers, trained their pre-sighted machine guns on the shoreline, and waited. The Allied infantry was pinned down against the seawall within minutes. The heavy Churchill tanks, brought in to force a breakout, immediately threw their tracks on the loose church shingle, or were systematically picked off by anti-tank artillery hidden deep within the cliffs. In a matter of hours, nearly 60% of the assault force was killed, wounded, or captured. Dieppe delivered a brutal, undeniable lesson that fundamentally altered the Allied strategy for the rest of the war. A direct frontal assault against an intact port was a suicidal gamble. The German High Command had learned the exact same lesson from that very beach. Following the raid, Adolf Hitler recognized that any future invasion would require a massive logistical hub, so he ordered the fortification of every major harbor along the Atlantic coast. Cities like Calais, Le Havre, Cherbourg, and Brest were transformed into what the Germans designated as Festungen, fortresses. They were ringed by massive coastal batteries, flooded approaches, and dense minefields, with garrison commanders under absolute orders to fight to the last man. The Allies knew that to successfully invade France, they had to bypass these fortresses entirely and land on open, unprotected beaches. But that merely shifted the problem. Landing on an open beach meant arriving without a port. The strategic compromise the Allies developed was an agonizing race against time. The master plan for the Normandy invasion dictated that the American forces would assault the open sands of Omaha and Utah, establish a beachhead, and then immediately pivot north to fight their way up the Cotentin Peninsula. Their primary objective was the deep-water port of Cherbourg. According to the meticulous Allied timetables, Cherbourg was scheduled to fall into American hands by D-Day plus 14, 2 weeks. For 14 days, the invasion forces would have to survive on whatever supplies could be dragged directly across the surf. But even if the American infantry managed to fight their way through the brutal, claustrophobic hedgerow country and capture the city exactly on schedule, securing the geographical location of a port did not mean securing a functional logistical hub. Allied intelligence fully understood the German defensive doctrine. The German strategy was a dual-layered mechanism. If their fortress garrisons could not hold the city, they were ordered to ensure the Allies could never use it. The moment American troops closed in on a harbor, specialized German demolition teams would execute a systematic, highly engineered, scorched earth protocol. They were not simply going to burn a few wooden warehouses or scuttle a handful of patrol boats. The Germans planned to meticulously obliterate the very mechanics of the port. They would use precision explosives to drop massive, multi-ton dockside cranes directly into the deep-water navigation channels, creating an impenetrable underwater barricade of twisted steel. They would pack the main lock gates with high explosives, blowing them to pieces so the inner basins would drain completely during low tide, leaving transport ships stranded and broken in the mud. They would shatter the concrete quays, pulverize the railway lines leading to the docks, and seed the harbor floor with acoustic and magnetic mines. Finally, they would maneuver large block ships into the narrowest choke points and deliberately sink them. By the time an American soldier actually stood on the docks of Cherbourg, they would not be looking at a functioning supply artery. They would be looking at a chaotic, heavily mined, mechanical graveyard. This was the ultimate strategic deadlock. You cannot sustain a mechanized invasion without a heavy port. You cannot capture a heavy port without a massive invasion. And even if you do miraculously capture one, the inevitable German sabotage meant it would take months of dangerous, intense engineering work by salvage divers and demolition experts just to clear the wreckage before a single cargo ship could safely tie up and unload. But the invasion timeline could not afford to wait months. It could not even afford to wait weeks. The American tanks grinding through Normandy needed fuel on D-Day +1, +2, and +3. The infantry needed millions of rounds of small arms ammunition just to hold the line. The artillery required an endless mountain of high-explosive shells to counter the inevitable German armored counterattacks. The math was entirely unforgiving, and it pointed directly to starvation for the Allied armies on the French shore. The logistical gap between landing on an open beach and waiting for a captured port to be cleared was a fatal vulnerability. To bridge that fatal gap, the Allied planners, driven primarily by British engineering ingenuity, proposed a solution so radical, so unprecedented in the history of warfare, that it bordered on absolute madness. If military doctrine dictated that a mechanized army required a heavy-duty, deep-water port to survive, and capturing an existing French port intact was physically impossible due to German sabotage, then there was only one logical alternative. The Allies would not capture a port. They would bring their own. They conceived an impossible engineering gamble. They would design and build an entire, functioning deep-water harbor from scratch. They would construct it in secrecy across the shipyards, dry docks, and river estuaries of Great Britain. They would assemble millions of tons of reinforced concrete and structural steel, engineer it into massive, towable, prefabricated elements, and then drag the entire city-sized infrastructure across 100 miles of the treacherous English Channel. Once it arrived off the coast of Normandy, they would sink it, assemble it, and bolt it together right off the American and British beaches, constructing an artificial harbor the size of Dover in the middle of an active war zone. This monumental, desperate undertaking was given the codename Project Mulberry. The concept defied the boundaries of naval architecture. It was a race to manufacture a geographical feature out of steel and concrete, substituting brute force engineering for the lack of a natural harbor, and entirely bypassing the German port fortresses. The strategic theory was flawless, but paper concepts and shipyard blueprints are one thing. The English Channel is a notoriously volatile and unforgiving stretch of water, famous for sudden, violent shifts in weather and immense tidal swings that alter the depth of the sea by over 20 feet twice a day. The elements of this prefabricated port would have to be towed across the open ocean by a fleet of vulnerable tugboats, assembled under the threat of German coastal artillery and Luftwaffe attacks, and then immediately absorb the crushing, relentless daily offloading of tens of thousands of tons of heavy cargo. How could a massive floating port possibly survive the open sea, the violent tidal surges, and the sheer mechanical punishment of offloading an invading army? The answer began on D-Day +1, in the blood-stained waters directly off Omaha Beach. While American infantry were still clearing snipers from the overlooking bluffs, Navy Seabees and salvage crews initiated the most frantic construction project in maritime history. The first step to surviving the open ocean was to kill the chaotic surf. They did not build a wall, they sank a fleet. A convoy of obsolete, stripped-down warships and merchant vessels, some bearing the rusted scars of World War I, steered deliberately into the shallow waters off the American sector. Explosive charges blew their bottoms out, settling their heavy steel hulls into the sand to form a preliminary breakwater. But a line of dead ships was not enough to shelter a port. Behind them came the real brute force of the Mulberry design. Massive, 6,000-ton hollow concrete blocks, codenamed Phoenix caissons, were towed across the channel at a painfully slow 4 knots. Standing as tall as a 6-story apartment building, these were essentially floating concrete castles. Tugboat crews maneuvered them into precise alignments before engineers scrambled aboard to open internal flooding valves. The immense concrete boxes sank to the sea floor, forming a 2-mile-long artificial reef. Inside this newly formed lagoon, the water suddenly turned remarkably calm, finally providing a safe anchorage where deep-draft cargo ships could wait without being battered by the open ocean. Yet, the heavy cargo was still hundreds of yards from the sand. To bridge that gap, American engineers deployed the most mechanically complex element of the entire operation, the whale roadways. These were miles of prefabricated floating steel bridges. An ordinary pontoon bridge would have been instantly ripped apart by the Normandy tides, which rose and fell an astonishing 20 feet every single day. The engineers solved this with dynamic pierheads, massive steel platforms, supported by heavy steel legs resting on the seabed, operated on a complex system of pulleys and buoyancy. As the tide surged in, the platforms and their attached roadways floated up. As the tide retreated, they slid back down. They breathed with the ocean, creating a continuous, unbroken highway from the deep water directly onto the Omaha sands. By June 16th, Mulberry A was officially operational, and the impact was immediate and staggering. Just days earlier, a large landing ship tank, an LST, would have to risk running aground, wait for the tide to recede, and take up to 12 agonizing hours to offload its cargo directly onto the chaotic beach. Now, LSTs simply docked at the floating pierheads. Their heavy bow doors swung open, and Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and supply trucks drove straight out of the ship, down the steel whale roadways, and onto the French continent in less than 2 hours. It was an industrial assembly line of war, pumping mechanized power directly into the beachhead. But the feeling of triumph on the floating docks masked a terrifying reality on the logistical spreadsheets. The invasion was a starving beast, and despite the miraculous construction of Mulberry A, it was still dangerously underfed. By June 18th, even with the artificial port functioning, the Americans were only hitting about 72% of their required supply target. The sheer volume of fuel and ammunition being consumed in the hedgerows was still outpacing what the port could process. Every single day was a desperate sprint to close that 28% gap. The entire American strategy now rested on this single, fragile artery. Mulberry A was an engineering miracle, but it was an unnatural structure, a temporary city built of hollow concrete and floating steel, bolted together in the open sea. It had temporarily tamed the tides, but it remained completely exposed to the elements. The invasion was surviving on a razor-thin margin, and that margin was entirely dependent on clear skies and calm waters. What would happen to the American army if the weather turned and the English Channel decided to tear the impossible harbor apart? The answer arrived not in the form of German bombers, counterattacking panzer divisions, or hidden U-boats, but as a catastrophic collapse in the barometric pressure over the English Channel. On the evening of June 18th, exactly as the artificial port was beginning to hit its mechanical stride and pump real volume onto the beach, the sky above Normandy darkened into a bruised, menacing gray. In the middle of June, military meteorologists expected the typical summer calm, a predictable, weeks-long window of atmospheric stability that the entire invasion timetable was deeply predicated upon. Instead, an unseasonal, freak meteorological anomaly began to rapidly organize off the coast. The wind shifted violently to the northeast, blowing directly into the unprotected, open maw of the Omaha beachhead. By the morning of June 19th, this shifting frontal system had escalated into a massive, shrieking gale. It was the worst unseasonal summer storm the English Channel had witnessed in more than 40 years. The timing of the storm was brutally precise, and its geography was a death sentence for the American sector. The English Channel is essentially a geographical funnel, a narrow, turbulent body of water trapped between the landmasses of Great Britain and France. When a severe gale blows from the northeast, the wind has an uninterrupted fetch, hundreds of miles of open, frictionless water over which it can build compounding momentum. The storm did not just whip up the surface of the sea. It grabbed the entire ocean and hurled it relentlessly against the shallow Normandy coast. Within hours, the sea transformed from a navigable logistical highway into a churning, violent battering ram of gray water. The waves rapidly surged to heights of 8 to 10 feet, driven by sustained, howling winds of 30 to 40 knots. And this was not a passing afternoon squall. It was a prolonged, merciless 3-day siege. For the supply officers, quartermasters, and naval commanders standing on the sand, the crisis was immediate, absolute, and paralyzing. The cross-channel pipeline, the very lifeline of the mechanized invasion, was instantly severed at the source. In the deep water ports of southern England, dozens of massive Liberty ships and transport vessels, fully loaded in their holds with critical artillery shells, combat rations, and highly volatile aviation fuel, were ordered to drop their anchors and hold their positions indefinitely. The risk of sinking in the open channel was deemed too great. The slow-moving naval tugboats, tasked with towing the remaining massive concrete caissons and floating bridge sections across the water to reinforce the Mulberry Harbor's outer edges, were caught out in the open, violently pitching sea. Unable to fight the overwhelming swell and taking on heavy water, several tug crews were forced to sever their heavy tow lines just to survive, abandoning thousands of tons of irreplaceable engineering equipment to sink to the bottom of the sea. But the true nightmare was unfolding right off the coast of Omaha Beach. The artificial harbor, Mulberry A, had been meticulously designed with specific, calculated engineering tolerances. It was built to withstand the normal summer weather of the channel, to tame the rolling surf, and create a calm, working lagoon for the cargo ships. It was never designed to absorb the sustained, kinetic fury of a localized hurricane. especially before its outer defensive breakwaters were completely finished. How do you protect a fragile, floating structure made of hollow concrete and flexible steel when the sea itself becomes an inescapable, crushing weapon? The destruction of Mulberry A was not a sudden, explosive event, but a prolonged, excruciating mechanical death that played out over 72 agonizing hours. It began at the outer edge of the defenses. The first line of protection was the Gooseberry Breakwater, the line of obsolete, stripped-down warships that had been deliberately sunk to the ocean floor to break the surf. As the storm surge rose, driven by the gale force winds pushing a massive, unseasonal spring tide, the ocean simply rolled entirely over the top of the sunken ships. The protective lagoon instantly disappeared. The full, unmitigated weight of the Atlantic swells began crashing directly into the Phoenix caissons, the 6,000-ton concrete fortresses that formed the primary structural wall of the artificial harbor. These massive blocks, featuring concrete walls up to 2 feet thick, were resting on the sandy seabed, held in place purely by their own immense flooded weight. But the seabed off Omaha was rapidly shifting, violently scoured by the extreme underwater currents generated by the storm's undertow. As the sand washed away from beneath their flat bottoms, the giant concrete caissons began to shudder, tilt, and grind aggressively against one another. The rigid mortar cracked. The structural integrity of the 2-mile-long wall began to systematically fail under the relentless, rhythmic pounding of the waves, causing the massive blocks to list at fatal angles, allowing the violent surf to pour directly into the harbor. Inside the harbor, the situation rapidly devolved into absolute, terrifying chaos. The beating heart of the Mulberry A system was the Whale Roadway, the miles of prefabricated floating steel pontoon bridges designed to carry heavy Sherman tanks and supply trucks from the deep-water pierheads directly onto the beach. These specialized roadways were ingeniously engineered to float up and down with the gentle, vertical rise of the standard tide. They were decidedly not engineered for extreme torsional stress or violent vertical whipping. As the massive waves breached the outer defenses and smashed into the inner lagoon, the 80-ton steel roadway spans were violently pitched into the air and then slammed aggressively down into the troughs of the waves. The heavy steel connection joints, built to flex slightly, were suddenly pushed far past their breaking points. The sound of the destruction was deafening, a continuous, shrieking metallic roar as thousands of tons of steel twisted, sheared, and violently snapped apart under the pressure of the ocean. The heavy braided mooring cables that anchored the floating pierheads to the ocean floor began to snap like massive rifle shots under the extreme tension, whipping through the air and decapitating the structural supports. But the elements themselves were not the only weapon actively destroying the harbor. The fatal, irrecoverable blow was delivered by the Allies' own equipment. When the storm struck, hundreds of small landing craft, LCTs, LCAs, and flat-bottomed motorized barges were actively operating in the waters around Omaha, frantically trying to ferry supplies and personnel. As the wind and waves intensified beyond operational limits, these flat-bottomed, unseaworthy vessels became utterly uncontrollable. Their small diesel engines were no match for the gale-force winds and the sweeping currents. Crews were forced to abandon ship to save their own lives, or were helplessly swept along by the raging water. Dozens of these heavy, steel-hulled craft, weighing hundreds of tons each, were picked up by the massive waves and hurled directly into the delicate, vital infrastructure of Mulberry A. They became unguided, multi-ton torpedoes. A derelict landing craft tank would be lifted high on the crest of a massive swell and slammed violently into the side of a floating whale roadway. The immense kinetic impact would instantly crush the supporting pontoons, buckling the central steel spine of the bridge. Then, the next wave would pick up another heavy barge and smash it repeatedly against the cracking concrete of the Phoenix caissons. For 3 straight days and nights, this violent, catastrophic mechanical pinball game continued without pause. The out-of-control vessels repeatedly rammed the piers, the roadways, and the breakwaters, acting as massive steel battering rams, systematically dismantling the port. By the time the wind finally began to die down and the skies cleared on the morning of June 22nd, the sea off Omaha Beach was completely unrecognizable. Mulberry A, the unprecedented engineering miracle that had consumed millions of man-hours, vast fortunes of national treasure, and thousands of tons of raw steel, was completely annihilated. It was not merely damaged, it was a mangled, chaotic, submerged scrapyard. The massive concrete caissons were shattered, their backs broken, leaning at grotesque, useless angles into the surf. The floating steel roadways were twisted into unrecognizable, jagged metallic knots, half buried in the shifting sand, or sunk completely to the bottom of the channel. The deep-water pierheads were smashed, submerged, and tangled in a web of snapped cables and sunken landing craft. The artificial port was gone, destroyed permanently, beyond any hope of salvage or repair. Across the lines, watching this devastation unfold from their elevated observation posts and command bunkers, the German High Command felt a sudden surge of cold, calculated optimism. From their vantage points further inland, the officers of the German 7th Army could see the English Channel boiling with whitecaps. They could not see the microscopic details of the twisted steel or the sunken concrete, but they could clearly see the ultimate strategic result. The massive Allied supply fleet was entirely paralyzed. The unending, terrifying stream of landing craft had vanished from the surf. For 3 consecutive days, the American beachhead received virtually no reinforcements, no fuel, and no ammunition. For Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and Commander-in-Chief Gerd von Rundstedt, this unseasonal storm was the precise strategic equalizer they had been desperately waiting for. The German defensive doctrine in Normandy had been under immense localized strain. The sheer volume of American firepower, particularly the devastating pinpoint accuracy of naval artillery and the absolute, uncontested supremacy of Allied tactical air power, had prevented the Germans from launching the massive, coordinated armored counterattacks necessary to drive the invasion back into the sea. But the storm temporarily grounded the deadly American P-47 Thunderbolts, blinding the Allied air forces and, more importantly, it completely severed the American logistical artery at its most vulnerable point. The German calculation was brutally pragmatic and deeply rooted in the mathematics of attrition. Why risk their precious, dwindling reserves of heavy Panther and Tiger tanks in a costly, bloody frontal assault against entrenched American infantry, when the Americans were about to defeat themselves? The Wehrmacht command understood the terrifying mathematics of a modern mechanized army better than anyone in the world. They knew exactly how much gasoline a Sherman tank battalion burned in a single day of intense combat maneuvering. They knew the astronomical, unsustainable rate at which a single American artillery battery consumed 105mm and 155mm high-explosive shells during a sustained barrage. Without a functioning high-volume port, the American forces on the continent were essentially a giant stranded whale. They had hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of machines, but they were rapidly bleeding out the very physical resources required to make them a lethal fighting force. The German command decided to immediately leverage this logistical paralysis. Instead of throwing their heavy armor into the teeth of the American lines at Omaha, they deliberately shifted their strategic focus to reinforcing the absolute denial of the one geographical asset the Americans needed most to survive: the deep-water port of Cherbourg. The German strategy was brilliantly simple. Let the unseasonal storm destroy the artificial harbor, and let the highly trained German demolition teams destroy the real harbor. While the Americans were pinned down, suffocating on the beaches without supplies, the Wehrmacht would pour additional troops into the massive concrete fortifications ringing Cherbourg. They would dig their trenches deeper, lay thousands of additional anti-tank mines, and execute their scorched earth sabotage of the docks and massive cranes with meticulous, uninterrupted precision. The German generals firmly believed that the unseasonal gale had permanently broken the aggressive momentum of the invasion, Without a massive, uninterrupted influx of cargo, the American breakout attempt would inevitably stall, leaving their massive army trapped in the claustrophobic, easily defended hedgerows of the bocage, slowly starving to death on the very edge of the continent, unable to move forward or retreat. Back on the American side of the lines, the crushing reality of the situation was settling over the command staff like a suffocating, heavy blanket. The ultimate strategic dead end they had feared since the earliest planning stages of Operation Overlord in London was now a terrifying, undeniable reality on the ground. The bespoke artificial port, the ultimate billion-dollar insurance policy against the brutal German fortress strategy, had been utterly wiped off the map by the weather. It was a total, unmitigated, catastrophic loss, and Cherbourg offered absolutely no immediate salvation for the starving army. American infantry from the 7th Corps were indeed violently fighting their way up the rugged terrain of the Cotentin Peninsula, engaged in brutal, close-quarters combat against deeply entrenched, fanatical German defenders. But they were still miles away from the city limits, and the fighting was slower, bloodier, and far more costly than anyone at Supreme Headquarters had anticipated. Even if the infantry miraculously managed to break through the defensive belts and capture Cherbourg the very next day, Allied intelligence confirmed what every logistics officer already dreaded. The harbor was a ruined, pulverized wasteland. It would take weeks, if not months, of highly dangerous underwater clearance by Navy salvage divers and combat engineers before a single transport ship could safely dock and unload its cargo. The bespoke floating port was dead. The natural deep water port was blocked and ruined, and the combat units fighting inland were rapidly approaching a critical red line emergency. Out in the dense bocage country, the 1st Infantry Division, the 29th Infantry, and the 2nd Armored Division were engaged in a grueling, bloody war of attrition against a determined enemy. The ancient hedgerows were natural, impenetrable fortresses, requiring massive, continuous amounts of high explosives, white phosphorus, and mortar fire just to clear a single field. But with the cross-channel pipeline completely severed for 3 agonizing days, the logistical reserves piled on the beach had been completely drained. The terrifying math of the invasion had finally caught up with the Americans. The army was burning through supplies at an astronomical, unyielding rate, but the daily intake had dropped to absolute zero. Quartermasters standing on the chaotic beach were staring at completely empty ammunition dumps, their clipboards documenting a disaster. Tank commanders on the front lines were anxiously checking their fuel gauges and realizing they simply did not have enough gasoline to sustain an offensive maneuver, or even reposition to meet a threat. They were being forced to idle their engines, effectively turning their highly mobile armored vehicles into static, highly vulnerable steel pillboxes. Artillery batteries, the very backbone of the American tactical doctrine that kept the German armor at bay, were issued strict, agonizing orders to immediately ration their high-explosive shells. They were heavily restricted to firing only in absolute, dire emergencies to repel direct enemy counterattacks. The aggressive forward momentum of the American war machine was rapidly grinding to a devastating halt. Every single hour that passed without a massive, sustained influx of heavy cargo brought the invasion dangerously closer to a catastrophic tipping point. If a mechanized army cannot move, and it cannot shoot, it fundamentally ceases to be an army. It becomes a massive, stationary target. The men fighting in the dirt, the blood, and the mud of the front lines did not know the specific engineering details of the ruined artificial harbor behind them, but they could feel the sudden, terrifying silence of their own artillery, and they knew exactly what that meant. The lifeline had been cut, and they were on their own. For the Supreme Allied commanders, Dwight D. Eisenhower and Omar Bradley, the pressure radiating from the ruined beachhead was absolute and suffocating. They were staring directly down the barrel of a complete, irreversible logistical collapse. The entire meticulously crafted architecture of the Overlord supply plan had hinged on a singular foundational premise, that Mulberry A would reliably bridge the fatal time gap between the D-Day landings and the eventual activation of a captured, functional, deep-water port. Now that vital bridge had been violently dismantled by nature, leaving a gaping, impassable chasm in its place. This was the absolute nightmare scenario they had prayed to avoid. A localized logistical collapse on the Normandy beachhead would not just mean a temporary delay in the timetable. It could easily mean the total annihilation of the entire American Expeditionary Force. Without a continuous, uninterrupted river of fuel, rations, and ammunition, the American infantry could not advance another yard. Worse, they could not properly defend the ground they had already paid for in blood. The moment the skies fully cleared, the ground dried, and the German commanders realized the true extent of the American paralysis, the Wehrmacht would inevitably unleash their withheld, heavily armored panzer divisions. If the American artillery batteries were entirely out of shells, and the Sherman tanks were entirely out of gas, the vulnerable beachhead would be systematically sliced apart and driven violently back into the sea. The conflict was no longer just about defeating the German army in a test of tactical skill. It was about the sheer, terrifying helplessness of advanced human engineering being utterly erased by the raw, uncompromising power of nature, leaving hundreds of thousands of men stranded on a hostile, heavily defended shore. The Allied planners had tried to outsmart the geographic reality of a portless beach with concrete and steel, and the ocean had rejected their solution with extreme, devastating prejudice. With the artificial port completely annihilated and the deep-water docks of Cherbourg utterly useless, the American forces were staring at a catastrophic, seemingly insurmountable dead end. The rigid physics of moving heavy cargo dictated that they were finished, mathematically guaranteed to starve. If the port was so vital to survival, why didn't the American offensive suffocate on the beaches? The survival of the American army did not come from a miraculous restoration of their artificial harbor, nor did it come from a suddenly operational Cherbourg. It came from a radical, decentralized doctrine of amphibious warfare forged thousands of miles away. During the brutal early war landings in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, the United States military had learned to operate without pristine maritime infrastructure. They had not just built an army of infantrymen, they had forged a highly adaptable logistical machine. When Mulberry A collapsed into the surf, the commanders on the beach did not pause to wait for London to engineer a new solution. They immediately reverted to brute force. First, they had to clear the mechanical graveyard. Combat engineers and Navy salvage divers swarmed the wrecked lagoon. Instead of attempting the impossible task of rebuilding the mangled steel roadways, they shoved the twisted metal aside. They used explosives to blast clear navigational pathways through the shattered concrete caissons. They essentially weaponized the disaster, leaving the sunken, ruined remnants of the Mulberry in place to act as a crude, jagged breakwater, blunting just enough of the incoming surf to make the water workable. With the approaches cleared, the Americans saturated the open shoreline with a continuous, chaotic wave of specialized landing craft. Captains of massive LSTs, landing ship tanks, abandoned the concept of docking safely at a civilized pier. Instead, they deliberately drove their 300-foot flat-bottomed ships at full throttle directly onto the sand at high tide. When the ocean retreated, leaving the massive steel vessels completely beached, heavy bow doors swung open, dropping ramps straight onto the wet tidal flats. Sherman tanks and heavy supply trucks, fully loaded with artillery shells, drove straight out of the holds and into the traffic of the beach. Out in the deeper water, transport ships continuously winched cargo nets down into hundreds of smaller LCTs and amphibious DUKWs, wheeled trucks that could swim through the surf and drive directly up the dunes without stopping to transfer their loads. Navy Seabees rapidly bolted together flexible steel pontoon causeways, creating floating driveways that rode the violent tidal shifts far more effectively than the rigid, over-engineered docks of the lost harbor. The beachhead transformed from a paralyzed disaster zone into a frenzied, decentralized cargo terminal. Shore repair parties, mechanics, and quartermasters worked in exhausting 24-hour shifts, hauling crates and clearing traffic jams under the glare of harsh floodlights. By June 23rd, the beach was breathing again. Mass unloading had completely resumed, bypassing the ruined port entirely and operating directly over the sand. The fundamental nature of the conflict had shifted. The Americans were no longer just fighting the German army. They were fighting the physical, exhausting limitations of the shoreline itself, using raw manpower and mechanical endurance to force an invading army through a geographical bottleneck. This brute force logistical assault had saved the invasion from immediate suffocation, but replacing an engineered deep-water port with thousands of beached landing craft and amphibious trucks raised a terrifying mathematical question. Could this decentralized, chaotic scramble through the surf truly match the staggering daily volume required to keep a mechanized war machine alive? The answer was delivered in a staggering display of sheer human endurance. The decentralized scramble did not just match the original pristine engineering timetables, it violently shattered them. But the cost of that speed was extracted directly from the flesh and bone of the men working the shoreline. The beaches of Omaha and Utah transformed into scenes of organized, relentless mechanical chaos. Without the sophisticated floating whale roadways to smoothly roll heavy trucks inland, the massive burden of the invasion fell squarely onto the shoulders of Navy Seabees, Army quartermasters, and segregated African-American port battalions. They worked in punishing, uninterrupted 24-hour shifts, their eyes burning from diesel fumes, salt water, and profound sleep deprivation. The operation had devolved from a marvel of modern naval architecture into a brutal, grueling war against friction and gravity. Thousands of tons of artillery shells, medical supplies, and highly volatile jerrycans of fuel had to be manhandled out of the plunging bellies of LCTs. Heavy cargo nets were frantically hoisted over the gunnels by groaning winches and dropped heavily into the beds of waiting amphibious DUKWs. When the specialized trucks broke down or the tides shifted unfavorably, men simply waded waist-deep into the freezing, oil-slicked surf, physically carrying crates of heavy ammunition directly onto the sand under the blinding, surreal glare of carbon arc floodlights. It was an excruciating, back-breaking marathon of survival. Yet this raw, unyielding application of muscle and decentralized logistics produced an operational miracle that no planner in London had dared to predict. By the last week of June, the over-the-beach method was generating an unprecedented logistical surge. Omaha Beach, operating entirely without its destroyed billion-dollar artificial port, pushed its daily cargo intake to an astonishing 115% of its original planned capacity. A few miles away, Utah Beach, utilizing the exact same grueling methods, hit an incredible 124%. The absolute crescendo of this frantic effort arrived on D-Day plus 24. In a single, relentless 24-hour period, the combined American beaches processed over 20,500 long tons of cargo directly over the sand. To put that in perspective, it was a staggering logistical milestone that utterly crushed the original, highly engineered target of 17,500 tons. The American military had effectively replaced the ruined concrete and twisted steel of Mulberry A with the sheer, unrelenting mechanical will of its personnel, pushing more supplies through the chaotic surf than the pristine harbor was ever supposed to handle. However, amidst this breathtaking daily volume, the unforgiving mathematics of the invasion still cast a long, menacing shadow. Historical honesty requires looking beyond the daily records to the cumulative reality of the campaign. Even with these heroic, record-breaking surges in late June, the catastrophic three-day blackout caused by the unseasonal storm had dug a massive logistical hole that could not be instantly erased. By D-Day plus 24, the total cumulative volume of supplies landed since the initial invasion still lagged significantly behind the master projections. The American forces had managed to land only about 80% of their expected overall cargo, and a terrifyingly low 64.5% of their required vehicles. The staggering daily tonnage was finally keeping the army alive, allowing tanks to roll and artillery to fire, but the cumulative deficit was absolutely real. The mechanized beast was no longer suffocating, but it was still operating on a razor-thin margin, its reserves dangerously depleted. The crisis at Omaha had been broken by sheer, uncompromising adaptability. The Americans had survived the destruction of their artificial port by proving their logistics could not be collapsed into a single point of failure. But Mulberry A was only half of the massive engineering strategy conceived before the invasion. While the American sector had reverted to brute force to keep their army breathing, what had happened to the rest of the grand Allied plan? Just 12 miles east, along the Gold Beach sector at Arromanches, the other half of the grand engineering gamble was still standing. The British artificial harbor, Mulberry B, had faced the exact same unseasonal gale, but geography had intervened. Tucked into a naturally sheltered coastal curve and partially protected by a submerged offshore reef, the water here absorbed far less kinetic punishment. The British port survived the 3-day storm bruised, but functionally intact. But merely surviving was not enough. The harbor needed to be heavily reinforced to guarantee the wider invasion's lifeline. Allied engineers immediately looked to the wreckage at Omaha. Instead of abandoning the million-dollar American ruins, salvage crews systematically stripped Mulberry A down to its usable bones. Undamaged floating steel roadways, intact deep-water pierheads, and any salvageable concrete caissons were carefully extracted from the mangled American surf and towed east. The ruined American harbor was literally cannibalized to armor and expand the surviving British port, turning Mulberry B into a heavily fortified logistical hub that would continue operating for another 5 months. Yet, even functioning at maximum capacity, the British harbor at Arromanches was never designed to, and never did, supply the entire Allied expeditionary force by itself. The survival of the Normandy invasion ultimately relied on something far more powerful than a single engineering marvel. It thrived because the Allies had inadvertently forged a flexible, multi-layered supply web that could not be severed by one catastrophic failure. By July, the invasion was breathing through 3 distinct, overlapping arteries. In the east, the British were pumping mechanized cargo through the surviving concrete and steel of their artificial harbor. In the center, the Americans were violently manhandling tens of thousands of tons directly over the open sand through sheer brute force and decentralized amphibious logistics. And further west, Army combat engineers and Navy salvage divers were finally clearing the meticulous German demolitions in Cherbourg, slowly bringing a traditional captured deep-water port back to life. These 3 methods did not compete. They operated in relentless, continuous unison. The German defensive doctrine had banked entirely on a rigid mathematical equation. No port equals no supply, and no supply equals starvation. They believed the destruction of Mulberry A was the fatal, paralyzing blow. But the loss of the American harbor did not stall the Allied advance, because the military machine proved resilient enough to rapidly rewrite its entire supply chain while actively under fire. The invasion succeeded precisely because it was not tethered to a single point of failure. Adaptability had aggressively superseded static engineering. The true triumph of the Normandy logistics was not the millions of tons of hollow concrete dragged across the channel, but the unbreakable, dynamic system that figured out how to advance when the concrete shattered. When the German command fortified every natural port along the French coast, they built their defensive strategy on a seemingly flawless calculation. They believed that without a deep-water harbor, the invasion would inevitably suffocate under the immense mechanical weight of its own tanks and artillery. For a fleeting moment, as a historic storm tore the American artificial harbor into jagged steel wreckage off Omaha Beach, that calculation appeared perfectly correct. But the German generals drastically underestimated the nature of the enemy standing on the sand. The American military machine did not break when its billion-dollar concrete lifeline snapped. It instantly adapted, utilizing sheer manpower and relentless brute force to rewrite the rules of amphibious warfare. The Americans succeeded in maintaining the massive flow of supplies not because their artificial port was impossible to destroy, but because their logistical ingenuity was impossible to reduce to a single harbor.